Is President Trump finally losing patience with Vladimir Putin? That's the big question as Trump says the U.S. will resume weapons shipments to Ukraine's defenders as Russia launches what some reports are calling the war's biggest aerial attacks on Ukraine so far.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Joe Sternberg in London. President Trump's pledge to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office was never realistic, but now after 170 days, he's beginning to sound frustrated that just maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't actually want peace. Here's the president on Tuesday during an extraordinary cabinet meeting explaining his unhappiness with the Russian leader.
We get a lot of bull thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
And here's Trump a day earlier in a meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explaining that the U.S. is going to resume weapons shipments.
We're going to send some more weapons. We have to. They have to be able to defend themselves. They're getting hit very hard now. They're getting hit very hard. We're going to have to send more weapons. Yeah, defensive weapons primarily, but they're getting hit very, very hard. It's very sad. So many people are dying.
Kate, how do you account for this apparent shift in President Trump's attitude toward the Ukraine conflict and what effects it might have on U.S. policy and the battlefield situation on the ground?
Last week, the pause in shipments to Ukraine was rather abrupt and ensnared all different types of weapons, from Patriot missiles to artillery ammunition. And it seems to have caught elements of the administration off guard. A clip we didn't listen to of President Trump at the cabinet meeting. He was asked who ordered this pause, and he said, "I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" And so that is about as close as admission I think that we'll get, that it really wasn't a decision the president made to cut Ukraine off. And it's no secret that the Trump administration includes a lot of staffers who are ideologically opposed to giving arms to Ukraine. Some of them think, we can't use any Patriot missiles in Europe. We need to save them all for a war with China that may or may not come. Others of them think that we have no security interest in defending Ukraine or helping them. And so it looks like this was the product of some level of freestyling. And now Trump has said that we have to give them more weapons. I think the irony of what I was just describing is that Trump really articulated a view rooted in realist foreign policy. We have to give them more weapons. Putin is behaving with recalcitrance and is an immovable boulder to peace. And he is talking a big game about how he wants to have peace, but then he won't even agree to a temporary ceasefire and keeps asking for these absurd conditions like taking more ground than he currently holds. So I commend the president for coming to a very realistic view that we have to help Ukraine, and it's in our interest to do so to get Putin to come to the negotiating table to end the war.
Meantime, the bombs and drones and missiles keep being launched at Ukraine's defenders. Joe, news reports now saying that on Wednesday, after these remarks by President Trump at this cabinet meeting, there was the biggest aerial offensive yet. Ukrainian Air Force sources saying they saw 728 exploding drones and decoys. The previous record, by the way, was 539, which was on Friday. And so it does not seem to me that President Trump lacks for empirical evidence to support this conclusion that Vladimir Putin is not interested in negotiating some kind of peace in the short term here.
I think that a real lesson that people should be extracting from this experience is that this war, and particularly Vladimir Putin's war effort, is unfolding along a timetable and according to a logic that is very different from how a lot of people in Washington and in parts of the Trump orbit seem to have thought that it was going to operate. I think that there had been this notion that somehow Ukraine had provoked this invasion back in 2022 by trying to align itself to NATO more closely, that this was really a defensive war on Russia's part, and yet we're discovering that these escalations keep happening even as the drumbeat becomes more insistent for some kind of peace agreement, and Ukraine often seems to be willing to make various concessions to that end. That should be an opportunity for us to think that maybe Putin is thinking about the situation in a different way than some people in the U.S. have been assuming, and I think that he clearly perceives that he has interests in pursuing the war, to continuing to fight it. He keeps avoiding many of the very enticing off-ramps that are presented to him. At this moment when ordinarily you would think that it would be in his best interest to start dialing it back a little bit and participate in a peace process of some sort, he clearly thinks that he has an incentive to do otherwise. So, to the extent that President Trump seems to now be seeing what is in front of everyone's eyes here, I think that that's probably helpful. And you give an autocrat like Putin long enough, and he will show you what he intends to do. And I think that seems to be what's unfolding right now.
Okay, what about this now unpaused pause in U.S. aid shipments? CNN has a story yesterday. This is the beginning of it. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth did not inform the White House before he authorized a pause in weapon shipments to Ukraine last week, according to 5 sources familiar with the matter, setting off a scramble inside the administration to understand why the halt was implemented. I guess that would not be inconsistent with the haphazard policymaking we have seen from the Trump administration in all sorts of areas. But what do you make of that? The defense secretary apparently doing this without the president's sign-off, and particularly the arguments that you hear sometimes that we don't have enough of these munitions ourselves. Our supplies are running low, and so it's a mistake to be sending them off over to Ukraine.
I do think that is the ideology that's animating those who want to pause weapons. And look, anybody who has studied some of our defense problems and looked at how many air defense interceptors we have, how many Patriots we don't have enough. We are not making enough. That is 100% true. One of the Ukraine bills that Congress passed expanded Patriot production from about 550 to 650 and is trying to ramp up to that point. But the truth is we're going to need more than that. But at the same time, this is, first of all, an argument that the administration has an obligation to do something about it. If we can't help a U.S. friend who's fighting a hot war with a U.S. adversary, that's a big national crisis that I think deserves presidential level attention. And so the idea that the answer is to just let Ukraine be pummeled and not do anything about it is just wrong. We have not really made a serious attempt to expand our munitions inventories yet. One thing we could be doing even more of is trying to get these Patriot interceptors co-produced with some of our allies in Europe and Asia, because the ability to make them is almost as important as how many we have at any given time. But to my point about some leadership on this front, the White House is proposing a defense budget for next year that is pretty weak, pretty business as usual. Doesn't represent a large increase in our capacities. Why isn't the president then proposing to make a national all-out play to expand our inventories of air defense munitions? That to me is what I think would be needed. Now, in fairness, a couple weeks ago, I thought the Pentagon did a service by while they were describing how the attacks on Iran went, talking about how a Patriot team operated in defending a U.S. airbase and describing what it's like to shoot these interceptors up at incoming missiles and how amazing they are, amazing piece of technology. That should be the start of something at a presidential level of explaining to the public why we need more of these munitions and why we can't afford to run out of them. That to me is a far more credible case than just saying, well, we're going to lock them all in the cupboard and wait until our interests are really, really threatened in some more grave way, which is not something I think that a global power has the luxury of doing.
On the point about co-production, President Trump has long complained that U.S. allies, including in NATO, have been freeloading, as he sees it, off of the U.S. defense umbrella. And Joe, part of what I've been wondering also is if his attitude toward Ukraine might be shifting in part due to some changes in those NATO defense target. Late last month, the defense target was raised from 2% of GDP to 5% for NATO allies. That includes 3.5% to be spent on hard military assets. And I grant that there are some laggards who may have trouble meeting those targets, but I've been wondering whether this shift in Europe toward rearming, recognizing that the peace dividend of the end of the Cold War has not lasted, can't last forever. I wonder if that is changing President Trump's attitudes toward these allies, and particularly toward what the U.S., in his view, is prepared maybe to do in this Ukraine conflict.
Well, Kyle, I mean, it's occurred to me to wonder the same thing. And I think that probably a couple factors are going on here. I mean, if you sort of think about what the isolationist argument in Trump circles against supporting Ukraine was, there were always a bunch of elements of it. I mean, first off, there's a certain ideological sympathy for Russia in some parts of that camp. Even if you separate that out, there was this perception that it's a faraway war that doesn't really matter to U.S. interests, that we have bigger fish to fry in other places. And meanwhile, it is on Europe's doorstep. And if they aren't taking this conflict seriously by rearming themselves, preparing for their own defense and supporting Ukraine militarily, why should the U.S. take this more seriously than Europe does? And I think that what's happening, particularly over the past few weeks and months, is that a bunch of those isolationist assumptions in the U.S. are starting to fall by the wayside. I think that it's becoming clear that the U.S. does have a stake in maintaining deterrence. And frankly, I think that the Trump administration has discovered, as with the successful bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear sites, that it is possible for the U.S. to play a role in the world without having to do boots on the ground in these grinding 20-year-long military operations. So that's probably been a good lesson for Trump to learn as well. And he will have heard when he was at that NATO summit a couple weeks ago that Europe is taking this very seriously. And I think that a lot of countries across Europe, our NATO allies, are dramatically increasing their defense spending. They are interested in spending money on the right things, which means equipment and not just nice military bands, which was always sort of an issue that you could run into in some places over here. And so the message to Trump has been that Europe actually does take this conflict very seriously and is prepared to, put up its own resources to do something about it. And I think that makes it much easier for these leaders to argue that, we are really going all in on this, but we still need American support. And it might be that message has actually resonated with President Trump.
To that point, NATO's Secretary General is talking about five-fold increase in air defense capabilities, thousands more tanks and armored vehicles, millions of rounds of artillery ammunition. And Kate, pledges are one thing, and we have to make sure that those NATO allies make good on those pledges. But it seems to me that Trump was pretty pleased with this increasing of NATO's targets and a victory in his eyes that maybe he deserves credit for.
He does deserve credit. The other thing I would add to Joe's very good long list there is another driving force in this has been Putin's behavior and his unwillingness to negotiate. I mean, Trump has made any number of entreaties and phone calls, sent Steve Witkoff to talk to Putin multiple times. Trump has said that Ukraine will take NATO off the table. I mean, unilateral concessions, attempts to persuade him. None of it has worked. None of it has moved Putin off of his original aims. And I think that's because there's not just some territorial answer to be carved out here. I think what I'm getting at is that the U.S. strategy so far, I think, has underrated how much ideology and grievance really does animate Putin. Putin has, for instance, last year, I think, gained maybe the size of Rhode Island in territory in Ukraine and lost tens and tens of thousands of soldiers doing so. And I think the temptation is to look at that and think, why on earth would he do that? That makes no sense. And it's because he is animated to extinguish Ukraine, and this imperial tendency is deep in his thinking. And so I think perhaps that is starting to get more salience with the president, that Putin is not going to be persuaded off his position, and he'll have to start sending a different message. The only thing I'd add to that real quick is just there's a lot of discussion around air defense missiles, but what matters is getting Putin to come to the table and end the war. And so that is going to have to include sending Ukraine some long-range missiles and other types of equipment that make a difference on the battlefield and start to get at least some territory back and get Putin more on the defensive, so that he perceives he's not going to eliminate Ukraine and as an independent state, and he has to come to the table.
Another signal this week of the Trump administration's intentions may come out of the Senate. There's a Senate bill sponsored by Lindsey Graham of South Carolina with a supermajority of co-sponsors that would put pretty severe secondary sanctions on countries that buy, for example, Russian oil. There's been questions about why the Senate hasn't moved on that, but there may be some action coming shortly. Senate Majority Leader John Thune on Tuesday saying we'll have more to say about that later this week, and signaling there was a lot of interest in passing that bill. Then Lindsey Graham himself saying that Trump has now given his okay to pass that bill, saying Trump told me it's time to move, so we're going to move, unquote. So, Joe, I guess watch this space, but if that bill passes and if President Trump gives his enthusiastic endorsement of it, that would be another real concrete signal, I think, that his position on this conflict and the U.S.'s role in supporting the defenders of Ukraine has shifted.
Yeah, and I think that there are a couple moving parts here that we need to keep an eye on. One is, remember, this expresses a reality that foreign policy is usually mostly about a presidential administration, but not exclusively about the administration. You always have to manage the politics in various constituencies and whatever consensus emerges among lawmakers that you would hope represents where voters are on a particular issue. And I think that what we've discovered over the past few years is that at times there might be some skepticism from lawmakers about particular aid packages, particularly, I suspect, at times when there might have been a sense that the Europeans weren't fully stepping up themselves, or when it wasn't clear exactly what the U.S. policy objectives were for some of these packages. But, that does not mean that lawmakers are unsympathetic to Ukraine's situation or unaware of the broader strategic stakes here. And so I read this, the overwhelming support apparently in the Senate for the sanctions legislation as a sign that, despite some of the disagreements about particular policy steps here, there is a degree of consensus in Washington about what is at stake in this war right now. And, the other thing that we need to talk about a bit is President Trump personally, because he gets a bad rap, often deservedly so, for being mercurial. This is actually an instance where that might end up being a bit of an advantage, because he is not the sort of leader who is going to tie himself into a particular diplomatic track, or a particular track of any other sort in terms of how he's going to address this situation and Putin's intransigence here. I mean, Trump is nothing if not flexible, and this might be one of those instances where that flexibility ends up being an advantage, because he is not tied into some false or dangerous sense of consistency about what his approach has been up to now. He's proving he is not at all shy about changing his approach to Putin if the facts dictate that. And I think that it's important to remember that is a factor that's going on here, because Trump's mercurialness is such a feature that we tend to almost overlook it sometimes in a weird way.
Kate, what's your view of the debate coming in Congress, both on this sanctions bill, what difference it will make, what the specifics are of it, and then what comes next? Because is there, after this, going to be need for another congressionally approved aid package if President Trump wants to keep these U.S. weapons flowing, including the air defenses that the defenders of Ukraine are relying on, both on the front lines and also to protect cities, Kyiv, the capital, and other cities beyond. Is President Trump prepared, do you think, to go to Congress and say, I want another Ukraine aid package, and we'll be able to get that through?
I can't improve on Joe on the sanctions bill because I think he's exactly right, as it is a really good barometer of where Washington is. And as a bipartisan consensus, I think it could make a significant difference and show some resolve in Washington. And so I think, it could get teed up for a vote next week. And that would be a productive step, but it certainly can't replace the type of weapons support you're describing. And I think that Republicans, if Trump were to come to Congress and say, look, we need to get Putin to the table, and that involves sending long-range missiles and keeping them in stock of ammunition and being able to defend their cities, I think that Republicans would back him up. And would pass that support. We also, those bills have typically included money for replenishing U.S. weapons supplies, which is a big bipartisan priority to keep working on that production problem I was describing of Patriots and other types of munitions that are in short supply. So it could be additive to the U.S.'s own kind of industrial-based limitations if he did that. But there's no... But so I think the president could certainly get a Ukraine package through, and that Joe is also exactly right that while elements of Trump's base and administration have ideological distaste for Ukraine, Trump really doesn't share that, is much more flexible. And even yesterday he was describing, the Ukrainians have fought really bravely. So I don't think he has those same blinders on. But it would require some degree of leadership for him to propose it and say, well, we're going to stick to this until Putin comes to the table and ends the war.
But the point about replenishing U.S. weapon supplies, I think, is a good one, Joe. Maybe that would be a way to sell this package, is to put those two things together. And by the way, when we're talking about a 5% of GDP target for NATO allies, the U.S. is not hitting that either. So maybe the way to show some leadership here would be for the U.S. And President Trump to get the kind of defense buildup that the world situation maybe demands. And that's to speak of not only Ukraine, but the aggressiveness of China and a lot of other hotspots in the world.
One of the more irritating quirks of the isolationist crew in Trump's orbit is the way that they talk about these things as if they are all separate from each other. That you have Ukraine over here, and then you have Taiwan and China over there, and then you have Iran in that other place, and then you have this completely separate issue of the U.S.'s own weapons stockpiles and defense productive capacity and investments. And I think that really you need to understand that these are all part and parcel of the same situation, which is that, the U.S. has to have a plan for deterring allies or opponents and cultivating alliances. And I think that one of the ways that we do that is by using the resources that we have available right this minute to support friends in distress, as in Ukraine, and to the benefit of our European allies, at the same time that we commit to replenishing those stocks domestically and building up that industrial base. And so I think that, go ahead and resist the tendency to think of these as completely separate issues that are at odds with each other. They're actually complementary, and it really helps U.S. deterrence and security if we are moving them all down the field at the same time.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what Joe said in the sense that if you think that China isn't watching what's going on in Ukraine quite closely and making their own calculations, I venture you might not be paying attention. I mean, there's some reporting this week about how Russia is trying to ramp up its drone production. And so many of the parts, 50-60% of the parts that in these drones come from China. China is also feeding in legacy chips into Russia that are helping Russia rebuild its industrial base. The Shahed drones from Iran that Russia is using, the payloads of those drones have gotten larger. I mean, so this is a global test for the United States, and it certainly does not end at the borders of Ukraine.
Thank you, Kate and Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.